Monday, September 17, before Festus. After 2 years holding Paul in prison just to win the favour of the Jews, Felix was replaced by Porcius Festus as the governor of Judea, and we read about that in Acts 24:27. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favour to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Festus ruled from AD 60 to AD 62. Question. Read Acts 25, verses 1 through to 5. How does this help reveal the hatred that preaching the truth can cause in those who don't want to believe? Acts 25, verses 1 through to 5. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus as a favour to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there." After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. Probably because they already had failed once in their attempt to convince Felix of the charges against Paul, the leaders did not want to take any chances again. In what appears to have been Festus's first visit to Jerusalem, they requested, as a favour to them, a change of jurisdiction, asking him to hand Paul back to them so he could be tried by the Sanhedrin in accordance with Jewish law. Yet the request was only a camouflage to conceal their real intent, to kill Paul. Although Festus was willing to reopen the case, he said that the hearing would take place in Caesarea, not in Jerusalem, which means that Paul would be tried by Roman law. As soon as Festus was back in Caesarea, he convened the tribunal, and Paul's opponents started laying out the charges against Paul, as we read in verse 7. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. This time, Luke does not repeat the charges, but based on Paul's answer in verse 8, we can see that they were similar to the ones brought 2 years before, perhaps with the further emphasis that, for being an agitator, Paul also represented a threat to the empire. Question. Read Acts chapter 25, verses 9 through to 12. When sensing that Festus could use him for political reasons, how did Paul react? Acts 25, beginning at verse 9. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favour, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" Paul answered, "I am now willing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, "You have appealed to Caesar you will go." In the end, Festus turned out not much different from Felix with regard to his political strategies. Acts 24:27 again, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favour to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Unwilling to lose the Jews' support so early in his administration by declaring Paul innocent, he thought of granting them their original request, to have the apostle tried by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. This, however, was not acceptable to Paul, who knew he could not expect to be treated fairly there, left to the whim of his enemies. So, capitalizing on his Roman rights, he insisted that he was entitled to be tried by a Roman tribunal, and envisaged no other way out of that precarious situation. He resolved to appeal to the highest instance of Roman justice, which was the emperor himself.